September 21st, 1953, Kimpo Air Base, South Korea. It is a humid Monday morning, and for the American servicemen on the ground, it's just another day of uneasy peace. The armistice has been signed, the guns are supposedly silent, and the mess hall is packed with guys just trying to finish their lunch. Then the screaming starts, not the men, but the air. The air raid sirens erupt with a violence that sends coffee cups rattling off tables. Out on the runway, ground crews look up and freeze. A silver streak is tearing through the sky, diving straight toward the heart of the base at over 400 miles per hour. It's a MiG-15, the most feared fighter jet in the communist arsenal, the plane that has spent 3 years shredding American pilots over the Yalu River. The reaction is instant. Gunners scramble to their positions, tearing the covers off anti-aircraft batteries. Pilots sprint toward their F-86 Sabres, hearts hammering against their ribs. This is it. The peace was a lie. The communists are launching a surprise strike. But as the MiG levels out, something feels wrong. It doesn't bank for an attack run. It doesn't open fire. It doesn't drop a single bomb. It just lowers its landing gear and glides toward the tarmac with a terrifying, graceful precision. The tires screech against the asphalt, smoke billowing from the rubber as the pilot slams on the brakes, bringing the lethal machine to a halt right in the middle of a swarm of confused, armed American soldiers. The canopy pops open. A 21-year-old North Korean pilot in a crisp, dark uniform climbs out. He doesn't reach for a sidearm. He doesn't shout a battle cry. He just raises his hands high above his head and waits. His name is No Kum-sok, and he has just handed the United States the single most valuable gift of the Cold War. He didn't just escape the iron grip of the Kim regime, he brought them the crown jewel of Soviet engineering. But here is the part that will melt your brain. While the Pentagon was popping champagne and the CIA was doing backflips, No Kum-sok was staring at them in total confusion. He had no idea that the Americans had spent months dropping millions of leaflets over North Korea, promising a $100,000 reward to any pilot who defected with a MiG. He never saw the flyers, he never heard the radio broadcasts. He didn't do it for the money. He did it because he wanted to breathe. And in doing so, he pulled off one of the most audacious high-stakes defections in human history, fundamentally altering the DNA of aerial warfare forever.
To understand why this 21-year-old kid was the most hunted man on the planet for the next decade, you have to understand the absolute terror the MiG-15 inspired in 1953. For the first half of the Korean War, American pilots were walking into a buzzsaw. They were flying F-80 Shooting Stars and F-84 Thunderjets, planes that were respectable but ultimately outclassed. When the MiG-15 showed up, the game changed. It was faster, it could climb higher, it hit harder with a 37mm cannon that could tear a B-29 bomber in half with a single well-placed shot. American pilots were dying in droves in a stretch of sky known as MiG Alley. The Soviet-built jet was a mystery wrapped in a nightmare. U.S. intelligence was desperate. They weren't just curious, they were failing. They needed to know how the engine worked, how the wings were swept, and where the vulnerabilities were. But every time a MiG went down, it was either a fireball in the dirt or it crashed in enemy territory where communist recovery teams guarded their wreckage with their lives. So the CIA got creative. They launched Operation Moolah. It was a psychological warfare masterpiece. They printed millions of leaflets in Korean, Chinese, and Russian. They stuffed them into artillery shells and fired them across the lines. They had B-29s dump them like snow over North Korean air bases. The message was simple. Bring us a functional MiG-15 and we will give you $50,000. Then they doubled it to $100,000. In 1953, that was life-changing, buy your own island kind of money. Adjusted for inflation, we're talking over $1 million today. The Americans were literally trying to buy the secrets of the Soviet Union one pilot at a time. The only problem was, the great leader Kim Il-sung wasn't an idiot. He knew exactly what the Americans were doing. He grounded his best pilots, he increased surveillance, he made it clear that even looking at a piece of American paper was a death sentence for you and 3 generations of your family. This is where No Kum-sok's story goes from a military history footnote to a psychological thriller. No was born in 1932 in Sinuiji, a city right on the border of China. His father was a successful businessman, a man who believed in a free Korea. But when the peninsula was sliced in half after World War II, the family found themselves trapped on the wrong side of the line. The communists moved in and the cleansing began. Wealthy landowners and businessmen weren't just seen as the enemy, they were seen as parasites. One night in 1947, No's father just didn't come home. No knock at the door, no formal charges, no trial. He was erased. just another ghost in the foundation of the new regime.
No was only 15. He watched his mother's face turn into a mask of permanent, silent terror. She gave him one piece of advice that would save his life. Be the perfect communist. If they want you to clap, clap until your hands bleed. If they want you to cheer, cheer until your throat is raw. Hide your heart in a box and bury it deep. So, No became an actor. He joined the Red Youth League. He spent his nights memorizing Marxist-Leninist theory until he could recite it in his sleep. He volunteered for the hardest shifts on collective farms. He was the model citizen, the golden boy of the party. But inside, he was a volcano of cold, calculating rage. When the war broke out in 1950, he saw his opening. The regime was desperate for pilots. To the communists, a pilot was a high-value asset. But to No, a plane was a set of wings that could carry him away from the madness. He applied for the Air Force Academy and didn't just pass, he dominated. He had a natural aptitude for physics and a steady hand that didn't shake under pressure. At 18, he was sent to flight school, where the instructors were Soviet officers who didn't even bother to learn their students' names. They were Expendable Unit A or Expendable Unit B. The training was a meat grinder. If you failed a test, you weren't tutored. You were sent to the front lines as infantry, which was essentially a slow-motion execution. No watched his classmates disappear one by one. Some died in training accidents because the equipment was shoddy. Others were taken away by the secret police for ideological inconsistencies. No just kept his head down. He flew. He studied. He became one of the top cadets in the nation. By 1952, he was strapped into the cockpit of a MiG-15. This was the pinnacle. The Soviets were so paranoid about the technology that even the North Korean pilots weren't allowed to see certain parts of the manuals. They were told what buttons to push, but never why. They were treated like biological components of the machine. No flew over 100 combat missions. He saw the tracers of American sabers whizzing past his canopy. He saw the sky turn into a chaotic mess of fire and aluminum at 40,000 feet. He was good, exceptionally good. He never got shot down, and he never shot anyone else down. He was a ghost in the machine, playing a very long, very dangerous game. But escaping a communist airbase isn't like sneaking out of a house at night. It's a mathematical nightmare. Every drop of fuel is measured. Every flight path is logged. You fly in tight formations where your wingman isn't just your partner, he's your warden. If you deviate by 5 degrees, his orders are to blow you out of the sky before you can reach the border. The DMZ was and still is the most heavily defended strip of land on Earth. Thousands of anti-aircraft guns, radar stations, and patrol flights were all looking for one thing: a traitor. No waited. He watched the schedules. He analyzed the radar gaps. He realized that during routine training flights, the ground controllers were less attentive. They expected the pilots to stick to the patterns. He needed a moment of chaos, a sliver of time where he could disappear. September 21st, 1953. The armistice had been in place for 2 months. The war was over, but the tension was at a breaking point. No was stationed at Sunan Air Base near Pyongyang. It was a beautiful, clear morning, the kind of day where you can see for miles. No was assigned to a formation flight with several other MiGs. As he walked toward his aircraft, his heart was beating so hard he thought it would crack his ribs. He looked at the ground crew, men he had known for years, and realized he would never see them again. He climbed into the cockpit, the smell of jet fuel and hydraulic fluid filling his lungs. He went through the checklist: engine start, instruments green, radio check. Everything was normal. Everything was a lie. The formation took off, climbing to 5,000 feet and heading toward the coast. No was positioned in the middle of the pack. He waited for the formation to bank, creating a momentary blind spot for the other pilots. Then he did it. He shoved the throttle to the wall. The engine roared, a mechanical scream that echoed through his entire body. He didn't just turn, he dove. He dropped the MiG from 5,000 feet to 50 feet in seconds.
He was skimming the rice paddies, the wind shear from his jet knocking over peasants in the fields. He was flying so low that he had to pull up to avoid power lines. Behind him, the radio erupted. His commander was screaming his name. "No! Where are you going? Return to formation."
He didn't answer. He reached up, yanked the radio headset off his ears, and threw it onto the floor of the cockpit. He was finished with the voices of the party. He was finished with the lies. Now it was just him, the machine, and the horizon. He was pushing the MiG to its absolute limit, the airframe vibrating as he approached the speed of sound. He could see the DMZ ahead, a scar across the landscape. The North Korean batteries spotted him. They knew exactly what was happening. Tracers started arcing through the air, glowing red balls of fire reaching for his wings. A burst of flak exploded near his tail, the shockwave nearly flipping the aircraft. He didn't dodge, he didn't weave, he just stayed low, using the hills to mask his signature, heart rate pushing 200 beats per minute. And then he was over. He crossed the line. 1 second, he was a slave to a regime that killed his father. The next, he was in South Korean airspace. But he wasn't safe, not even close. To the Americans at Kimpo Air Base, he wasn't a defector, he was a target. Radar operators saw a high-speed blip coming from the north, straight at their base. They didn't have time to ask questions. They assumed it was a rogue pilot on a suicide mission or the start of a new invasion. The base went into a frenzy. No knew he was in trouble. He didn't have a radio to signal his intent. He didn't have a white flag. He had a 37mm cannon and a jet that looked like death. He saw the F-86s scrambling from the hangars. He knew if they got airborne, he was a dead man. He made a split-second decision. He didn't circle. He didn't wait for clearance. He lined up with the runway while he was still miles out and came in hot. He dropped his gear and his flaps, the plane bucking as it fought the drag. He touched down with a bone-jarring thud, the tires screaming as they grabbed the concrete. He was going too fast. He used every inch of that runway, the jet skidding to a stop just feet from the end of the asphalt. He sat there for a second, the engine winding down, the silence rushing back into the cockpit. He was surrounded. Dozens of American soldiers were running toward the plane, rifles leveled at his head. He could see the fear and the fury in their eyes. He slowly reached up, popped the canopy, and stood up in the cockpit. He raised his hands. He looked down at the soldiers, gave them the most terrified, hopeful smile in history, and waited to see if they would pull the trigger.
The tension on that runway lasted for what felt like an eternity. A young American intelligence officer pushed through the crowd, shouting, "Don't shoot! Look at his hands! He's surrendering!" The soldiers lowered their weapons, but they didn't relax. They pulled No from the cockpit, searched him for weapons, and rushed him into a secure room. They brought in a translator, a man who looked at No like he was a ghost. "Why are you here?" the translator asked. "I want to be free," No replied. The translator paused, then leaned in. "Do you know about the reward?" No looked at him, genuinely confused. "What reward?" "The $100,000 for the MiG." No's jaw hit the floor. He had risked everything, walked into the mouth of the dragon, and expected to be treated as a prisoner of war or maybe a refugee. He had no idea he had just become a very wealthy man. But the money was the least interesting part of the story for the Americans. Within hours, the MiG-15 was under a tarp being moved to a secret hangar. It was like Christmas morning for the U.S. Air Force. They had the white whale. They had the thing that had been killing them for years. They didn't waste a second. Engineers from Wright-Patterson Air Force Base were flown in. They tore that MiG apart piece by piece. They measured the thickness of the aluminum. They analyzed the metallurgy of the engine plates. They found something that embarrassed the entire Western world. The engine was a direct descendant of a British Rolls-Royce Nene jet engine. The British had sold the technology to the Soviets right after WW2, thinking they were being diplomatic. The Soviets had taken that gift and used it to build a machine that killed thousands of UN soldiers. The test flights were even more revealing. The legendary Chuck Yeager, the man who first broke the sound barrier, was flown in to test pilot the captured MiG. He took it up against the F-86 Sabre in mock dogfights. What they found changed the curriculum of every flight school in America. They discovered that while the MiG was faster and had a better climb rate, it had a fatal flaw. At high speeds, the controls became nearly impossible to move. It had a tendency to pitch up or go into an uncontrollable spin if pushed too hard.
It lacked a proper heating system for the pilot, meaning at high altitudes, the guy in the cockpit was freezing and losing focus. The gun sight was primitive compared to the American version.
They found the blind spots in the MiG's vision. They realized that if an American pilot could force a MiG into a high-speed diving turn, the MiG would likely lose control and crash on its own. They turned these technical vulnerabilities into tactical manuals. This information was rushed to the front lines. The kill ratio for American pilots, which was already improving, skyrocketed. The invincible MiG was officially solved. And it was all because one 21-year-old was tired of the lies. But for No Kum-sok, the victory was bitter. The great leader was humiliated. When the news of the defection hit Pyongyang, the regime went into a murderous frenzy. The commanders at Sunan airbase were executed. The guards who were on duty were sent to labor camps. But the worst of it was reserved for No's family. In North Korea, the guilt by association law means if one person betrays the state, their entire bloodline is erased. No's mother, the woman who had told him to keep his head down, was arrested. She was interrogated for months. Her property was seized. She was branded as the mother of the traitor of the century. She spent the rest of her life in a state of internal exile, watched every second of every day, a prisoner in her own country because of her son's choice. No would never see her again. He would spend the rest of his life carrying the weight of her suffering, a ghost that haunted every dollar he spent and every breath of free air he took. The US government, true to their word, gave him the $100,000. They also gave him a new name, Kenneth Rowe. They knew that North Korean and Soviet hit squads would be looking for him, so they moved him to the University of Delaware. Imagine the scene. A man who was flying the world's most advanced fighter jet over the Yalu River a few months ago is now sitting in a freshman engineering class, trying to figure out how to order a burger at the student union. He was a walking Cold War artifact, a man caught between two worlds. He was free, but he lived under the constant shadow of the CIA and the threat of the KGB. He moved frequently. He never told his neighbors who he was. He became a shadow in the American suburbs.
But Kenneth Rowe was brilliant. He used the reward money not for fast cars or luxury, but for education. He earned a degree in mechanical engineering from Delaware and then a master's from MIT. He spent the next 30-odd years working as an aeronautical engineer for major American companies. Think about the irony. The man who was trained by the Soviets to destroy American planes ended up helping design the next generation of American air power. He eventually became a professor of engineering, a quiet, polite man with a thick accent who taught thousands of students about the laws of thermodynamics and fluid dynamics. His students had no idea they were being taught by a man who had once been the most wanted pilot in the communist world. For over 40 years, Kenneth Rowe kept his secret. He lived the American dream, the house, the career, the family, but he lived it in silence. It wasn't until 1996, after the Cold War had ended and the world had moved on, that he finally decided to tell his story. He wrote a memoir called A MiG-15 to Freedom. In it, he didn't paint himself as a hero. He didn't say he was a champion of democracy or a Western spy. He was brutally honest. He said he was a man who was desperate. He was a man who saw a system that turned humans into gears and decided he would rather die in a fireball on a South Korean runway than spend one more day as a component of that machine. The MiG-15 he flew was still around. You can go see it today at the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio. It's sitting there, painted in its original North Korean markings, with that red star on the tail. It looks small compared to modern jets. It looks almost fragile. But for the men who flew against it, that piece of metal represents the thousands of American lives that were saved because of the data it provided. It represents the moment the mystery was solved. But more than that, it's a monument to the power of the individual. The Cold War is often told as a story of massive systems, governments, armies, and nuclear silos. But the course of that entire conflict was shifted by a 21-year-old kid who decided to turn left when the party told him to turn right. It's a reminder that no matter how much power a system has, no matter how much they watch you or threaten your family, they can never truly own the space between your ears.
No Kum-sok, or Kenneth Rowe, proved that you can't arrest an idea, and you can't build a wall high enough to keep out the human desire for autonomy. He lived until 2022, passing away at the age of 90. He saw the world change in ways he couldn't have imagined when he was skimming those rice paddies in 1953. He saw the Soviet Union collapse. He saw the rise of the digital age. But he never saw his home again.
He was a man without a country, a man who traded everything, his mother, his past, his identity, for the right to be himself. Was it worth it? That's a question only he could answer. But when you look at that MiG in the museum, you don't just see a weapon. You see the ultimate escape pod. You see a reminder that the most dangerous thing to a massive, oppressive system isn't a bomb or a missile. It's a single person who refuses to believe the lie. And if you think the age of the high-stakes defection is over, just look at the headlines coming out of the modern world. The faces change, the technology gets more complex, but the game is exactly the same. Because as long as there are systems that try to control the human spirit, there will be people like No Kum-sok waiting for their 2-minute window to dive for the deck and never look back. If you want to see what happened to the American pilots who had to face the MiG before NO's defection, you need to check out our deep dive on the Saber Knights and the secret history of MiG Alley. The truth about those dogfights is crazier than any movie you've ever seen. See you there.